I've called this paper, my paper, Leaving the Garden, Brexit and the Housing Crisis. In the good old days, before 23rd of June 2016, when barely a week passed without some new demonstration or protest against the latest round of austerity measures, cuts to benefits, ATOS deaths, privatization of the NHS, dismantling of the welfare state, erosion of civil liberties, expansion of police powers, deportation of immigrants, or declaration of war, it was still widely agreed that the most pressing political issue in the UK was the crisis of housing affordability. 4 years later, that issue has fallen down the hierarchy of the public's attention. Why campaign to save something as boring as social housing when you can save the world by doing yoga on Waterloo Bridge? But housing is not only an aspect of British life about which, drawing on the work of Architects for Social Housing, I can speak with some knowledge about how it has been influenced by a membership of the European Union. It is also where different strands of UK society, economic, political, and social, converge. Housing, therefore, is a prism through which to test the truth values of the claims about our membership of the EU, as well as the counter-arguments for leaving. I can't today go into the arguments for remaining, but they all imply, one way or another, that since 1973, when the UK belatedly joined the European Economic Community, we've been living through a golden age of economic growth and wealth creation, of unprecedented peace between the formerly warring nations of Europe, of multicultural tolerance and the rule of human rights in this best of all possible worlds. But what does housing reveal about the economic, political, and social realities of the pre-Brexit Garden of Britain, from which, like a modern-day Adam and Eve, we're so rashly attempting to eject ourselves? So part one of my paper is called UK Housing in the European Union. So unlike, for example, the way the European Union's fourth railway package, because I thought Eddie Dempsey was going to be here, has imposed the privatization on their railway services on member states, the influence of EU legislation on housing provision is less clear-cut. The line between neoliberalism as a late stage of capitalism since the 1970s and the EU as a legislative instrument of its implementation is blurred, or at least it is to me, because I'm not an expert on EU legislation. But current UK housing policy, which I do know something about, is based on three neoliberal principles. One, that attracting investment in UK residential property from the private sector, including foreign investors, overseas buyers, and offshore financial jurisdictions, should be the primary source of revenue for house building. Two, that according to the so-called law of supply and demand, massively increasing the supply of residential properties for market sale will reduce house prices in general across the board. And three, that the sale of prime and super prime residential properties for the highest possible market price will cross-subsidize the provision of the so-called affordable housing in which UK citizens can actually afford to live. Now, all three of these principles, I believe, are fundamentally flawed as a model for the provision of housing need. One, because private investment in the UK property market has transformed our housing into a global commodity, with investors, to just take one example, speculating on shares in the value uplift consequent upon planning permission being granted on a piece of land they will never see and which may never even be developed. Two, because the law of supply and demand doesn't describe this property market, whose financialization by global capital has driven prices up as it is intended to rather than down. And three, because far from cross-subsidizing even affordable housing, let alone homes for social rent, such investment is instead funding the estate regeneration program that is demolishing tens of thousands of council homes to make way for the development primarily market sale properties. Now, as a result of these policies, these UK housing policies, between 2014 and 16, around 1 in 6 new build residential properties in London were sold to overseas investors. In 2017, that figure rose to 30%, and in the second half of 2018, overseas investors purchased 57% of all homes in central London. Now, although some overseas buyers might use their properties as a home for a week or so during the year, most investors are either buy-to-let landlords or speculators on London's housing market. Now, partly as a result of this investment, the total value of the UK housing stock in 2018 was £7.29 trillion. And that's risen by a third in the last decade alone. Nobody will be surprised to hear that 1.77 trillion of that housing stock is in London, nearly a quarter of the total, equivalent to 3.5 times the gross domestic product of the UK, and nearly 60% of the UK's entire net wealth. The UK property market now constitutes an economy unto itself. And it is this that UK housing policy is being written to keep afloat at the cost of the housing of its citizens. So, 58% of housing demand in London is for lower mainstream properties and homes for sub-market rent. Yet only a quarter of the properties with planning permission in the 5 years between 2017 and 21 will go on sale at this price. As a result, the number of residential properties under construction in London, unsold properties under construction in London, reached a record high of 31,500 last month, while the total number of unsold new build properties on sale for more than 1 million has hit a record high of 3,000 units. At the other end of the financial scale, of the 45,500 residential units completed in London in 2016-17, a mere 16% were even affordable housing, and of these, a mere 5% were for social rent, the lowest cost and most in-demand tenancy type. The remaining 84% were all for market sale. In the decades since the financial crisis, London's house prices have risen from an average of 245,000 in April 2009 to £463,000 today. That's more than 13 times the average London salary of £35,000. In inner London, the average price of a new build property is now £786,000. Meanwhile, rents on London's private market, in which 30% of London households now have to find a home, have risen to an average of £1,617 per month. That's 73% higher even than the UK average. The total rent paid by UK tenants last year rose to £51.6 billion. That's more than double, way more than the £22.6 billion they paid in 2007. At the same time, there are 20,000 long-term empty homes in London alone, with more than 10 times that number across England. Extraordinarily, half of the residential units in London's new build developments currently stand empty. Unsurprisingly, the likelihood of a residential property being empty rises with its market value. 39% of properties worth between £1 and £5 million are currently underused, a figure that rises to 64% for properties worth more than £5 million. And of the properties purchased by overseas buyers or investors, an appalling 42% stand empty. Now, as a result of what the European Union would describe as this liberalisation of UK housing provision, at the end of 2018, there were an estimated 165,000 people homeless in London alone. That's 1 in 52 of the capital's population, and over 300,000 homeless people across the UK. These numbers don't include the hidden homeless, with an estimated 1 in 5 people under the age of 25 having couch surfed over the last year. That's slept on someone's floor or couch. 225 of them in London. Roughly the same number, 244,000, are on council housing waiting lists in London. While across England, there are 1.16 million households waiting for a council home. Now, this is kind of a summary of the housing crisis. Given the lack of response from the British public to the causes of this housing crisis, either in the polling booth or on the streets of London, my very strong suspicion is that middle-class Remainers in general care very little about the negative effects of neoliberalism on other people, so long as they continue to profit from themselves, most noticeably from the rising value of their homes. Their well-mannered protests are not against the threat of these figures worsening if we leave the European Union, but expressive of their fears of becoming the victims rather than the beneficiaries of the neoliberalism responsible for them. Whether they know it or not, whether they admit it or not, those who vote to remain in the European Union are voting for more of the same, if not worse. Okay, part 2 is called UK Housing After the Referendum. In May 2016, the Sunday Times Rich List reported that 26 of the 100 wealthiest people in the UK listed property as a major source of their wealth. While among the richest 1,000, there were 164 property moguls with a combined wealth of £143.7 billion. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, the next month, the UK referendum returned a vote to leave the European Union by, as we know, 52% on a 72% turnout of the electorate at some 17.4 million people. Since then, the value of the pound has fallen from €1.26 and $1.42 to, at the beginning of this week, €1.12 and $1.27. That's 12 cents in the euro and 15 cents in the US dollar. The immediate effect of this was that by November 2016, it's only a few months later, over 400,000 Britons had lost their status as dollar millionaires. More importantly, however, was the drop in investment in UK housing, and especially in London, as a safe place for global capital. Now, as an example, I want to take as a case study of this disinvestment. One of the schemes that ASH, Architects of Social Housing, has proposed design alternatives for is the West Kensington and Gibbs Green council estates, which are in Hammersmith and Fulham in West London. We worked with these residents in the 8 months leading up to the referendum. 5 years before that, in June 2011, Capital and Counties Properties developers, a property developer, they're called Capco for short, which owns the adjoining Earl's Court site, they submitted a planning application to demolish and redevelop both of these council estates. In September 2012, despite the scheme being opposed by 80% of residents, Hammersmith and Fulham Council granted outline planning permission on the scheme, and the following April, both estates were stock transferred to Capco for £90 million. This was later estimated to be less than 10% of their market value at the time. Now, Capco's scheme proposed demolishing the 760 homes on the existing estates and replacing them with a total of 7,500 residential properties spread across the combined sites, the 2 estates and the Earl's Court one. Over 800 of these have been built on the Lily Square development to the south, where, to give you an idea, 2-bedroom apartments went on sale for £1.2 million. 89% of the additional homes were to be for market sale, with none set aside for social rent. The 760 new dwellings allocated to replace the demolished council estates on the 2 estates would be a mix of affordable rent, which can be up to 80% of market rate, rent-to-buy schemes, and shared ownership properties, which are far beyond the reach of most Londoners. Now, it was thanks to cowboy schemes like this, and there's hundreds of them across London, that in the 2 years before the referendum, the UK property market expanded by £400 billion. However, in the uncertainty leading up to the referendum, share prices for Capco, the developers, started to drop. They fell from £4.72 in August 2015 to £3.27 in March 2016. Following a slowdown in sales for the apartments in Lily Square, the £1 million sort of stuff, Capco's managing director said he feared the market for high-value residential dwellings in London was falling, and he was right. While the West Kensington and Gibbs Green estates are still standing, the demolition of the Earl's Court Exhibition Centre began in December 2014. Since that time, the site has lost more than half of its value. In fact, Capco's land holdings in the venture lost 10.5% of their value in the first 3 months of 2019 alone. According to a recent valuation, Capcare's share of the site is now worth £412 million, down from a pre-referendum peak of £803 million in 2015. Now, as a result of this, despite sitting on planning permission since 2012, not a single unit of luxury housing has been built on the former Earls Court site. Last year, Capco began looking for buyers on which to offload at least part of the land, but nobody has come forward. Capco's share prices continue to drop, falling 54% since its 2015 peak, and they've now admitted that this was primarily down to a reduction in the gross development value of the site once building work is completed. And last month, the local council, Hamlet, Smith and Fulham, announced that it would be raising the funds to compulsory purchase the site back. Now, when outraged liberals demand to know how I can possibly be in favour of Brexit, I point to the levelling off of house prices in England and the drop in house prices in London since the referendum, to the pause in London's estate demolition programme, of which this is an example, as overseas and offshore investors pull out of the UK property market, and to the fall in land values consequent upon both. These perceived negatives in the supposedly absolute good of economic growth on which capitalism relies for its profits are, in effect, positive forces against the so-called liberalisation of UK housing. Removing the barriers to renationalising housing provision in the UK, such as the EU prohibition on state aid, will require far more than leaving the European Union, beginning with overthrowing half a century of neoliberal orthodoxy. But just the threat of doing so has already removed some of the financial incentives to continue pursuing UK housing policy based on the investment needs of global capital rather than the housing needs of the UK population. However, there's a caveat to all this. Markets recoil from uncertainty. And perhaps when Boris Johnson is installed in number 10, that seems likely, and the new government removes what's left of our building and planning regulations before inventing further financial incentives for the global ruling class to invest even more of their dirty money in UK property, perhaps then the market will recover. And we really will look back on the years before Brexit as the good old days. But I don't think so. Perception is crucial to markets. And since the referendum dropped a turd into the cocktail glass of Europe, London has lost its reputation as the second home for Europe's jet-setting classes. So the customer base has contracted radically. Just as importantly, 275 city firms and £900 billion of financial assets have relocated out of the UK. That's a lot of bankers, hedge fund managers, financial advisors, and corporate lawyers who will no longer be living or investing in London property. Most importantly of all, the referendum, followed by the recent European Parliament elections, has shown that the UK can no longer be regarded as under the thumb of the Conservative Labour monopoly that will underwrite any sudden collapse in property values if and when the housing bubble bursts, as they did after the financial crisis. Perhaps, as some have predicted, the UK will become an offshore tax jurisdiction for global capital under the umbrella of US imperialism, although some would say London has already been that for some time. But there is another possibility. This is the third part of my talk, which is called the UK after Brexit. I doubt any of us who have suffered from the fiscal policies of austerity over the past decades have noticed the benefits of living in a country with the fifth largest economy in the world. Despite this, one of the apparently decisive arguments for remaining in the European Union is that a smaller GDP for a post-Brexit UK will increase social inequality. Now, the gross domestic product of the world in 2018 was about 80 trillion US dollars. And over a quarter of that, 20.5 trillion, came from the United States of America. To test the argument that greater national wealth means wider distribution of that wealth, you only have to look at the US, the richest country in the history of the world, where wages have not increased in real terms since the 1970s, which has no national health cover, the highest number and percentage of citizens in prison of any country in the world, the highest spending on the military of any country in the world, a corrupt, politicized, and militarized legal system, an institutionally racist police force, and a fascist game show host for a president. If that's what a quarter of the world's GDP gets you, maybe we could do with a different measure the wealth of our society. Most of us have lived our entire lives within one form or other of the European Union, a period coextensive with the rise of neoliberalism as the dominant economic and political system in Western democracies. And after 46 years of neoliberal governments, Conservative, Labour, Coalition, and Conservative again, there is perhaps no more ideologically hegemonic country in Europe than the UK, until now. Whatever its consequences for us, and that will depend on what we do after we leave the EU, if we leave the EU, the threat of Brexit has opened a wound in the hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. This accounts, I'd suggest, for the almost exclusively and overwhelmingly emotive character of the reactions to it, much as if we're religious fanatics who have been told our God is dead and it's time to find a new meaning to our lives. Personally, I'm a great believer in killing gods, which is the point of departure for the self-determination of the working class kept servile by their worship. The apparently firm conviction that free from the maternal embrace of Europe's fulsome breast, we will automatically fall into the paternal grasp of our evil fathers, shows, I think, just how childish and subservient we've become as an electorate, apparently capable only of choosing which brand of neoliberalism our political parties will spoon-feed us. It's a measure also of how complete has been the defeat of the political left in this country, that the only way liberals can think to defend themselves from the conservative right is to cling to the skirts of the European Union. If we'd spent half the effort we've squandered over the past few years arguing why we should remain part of the neoliberal empire, instead working to create a socialist alternative, we could be on the verge of a period of genuine political and economic change in the UK. We're not, but our work starts now. As the example of Greece has so brutally demonstrated, the European Union will not allow the democratically elected socialist government of a member state to govern in anything but name. Unlikely as it may seem in this most conservative of countries, if the UK is ever to have a socialist government, which, unlike Syriza, is not under the yoke of the unelected troika of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, escaping the iron grip of the European Union is the first step. Eating from the tree of knowledge always has its consequences, but how much longer do we want to live in ignorance and obedience to the god of neoliberalism? That's it.